Lecture 2, Fact and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code, Jesus of Nazareth and Mary Magdalene.
In the last lecture, we discussed the plot of the Da Vinci Code and considered whether aspects of its historical background were fictional rather than factual. In particular, we examined the role of Constantine in the history of early Christianity to see whether he was responsible for removing the feminine principle from Christian thinking, and whether it was he who chose which books were to belong in the Christian canon. We also examined that canon itself to see how it actually came into being, if it was not created on the basis of an imperial order. We can now move in this lecture to consider the most controversial claims of the Da Vinci Code, which have to do with the central figure in early Christianity, Jesus of Nazareth himself, and his alleged relationship with his female follower, Mary Magdalene. In the Da Vinci Code, the religious symbologist turned sleuth, Robert Langdon, and his beautiful sidekick, the French cryptologist Sylvia Neveu, are led through a series of clues to find the true nature and location of the Holy Grail. The Grail, they come to learn, is in fact not the cup from which Jesus drank at his Last Supper, but is the vessel that held his own seed, Mary Magdalene, to whom he was married and had a normal sexual relationship, producing an offspring and the start of a royal line. It's this that is the secret of the Grail, kept hidden for centuries by a mysterious religious order, the Priory of Sion, whose Grand Master had been Jacques Saunier, Neveu's own grandfather. Is this historical backdrop plausible? Could Jesus have been married to Mary Magdalene and had a child by her? The question takes us to the heart of the historical background of the Da Vinci Code and to the beginnings of Christianity itself, in the life of the historical Jesus. How can we know what Jesus said and did, and specifically whether or not he was married and had children? It may be easiest to proceed by considering some of the claims made about Jesus and Mary in the Da Vinci Code itself. In the Da Vinci Code, it is claimed that Jesus' life was recorded by thousands across the land of Israel. This is an actual quote from the book, that Jesus' life was recorded by thousands across the land of Israel. Could that be true? In point of fact, we have no evidence that Jesus' words and deeds were recorded by anyone while he was living. And we certainly have no records that go back to that time. We have no birth records, no accounts of his sayings, no records of his trial, his death, his burial, etc., that date from his own day. What we do have can be divided into sources written later by non-Christians and those produced by the Christians themselves. By and large, the non-Christian sources for the life of Jesus are late, sparse, and of little use. These include the testimonies of later Roman writers, the earliest of which is a Roman author named Pliny the Younger, who about the year 112 wrote a letter to the emperor, Trajan, in which he mentioned that there were a group of people called Christians in his territory, and he wanted to know what to do about these Christians, and he pointed out that they were named after somebody called Christ. That's the first reference we have to Jesus outside of Christian circles, and it dates from the year 112, so about 80 years after Jesus died. That's the first time any Roman ever even mentions Jesus. Soon thereafter, we have a reference to Jesus in the writings of the Roman historian Tacitus, who tells us that Jesus had a following in Judea and that he was executed on the order of Pontius Pilate. He's writing around the year 115. So about 80 or 85 years after Jesus' death, we start getting some references to his life, by Roman historians. There's one Jewish historian who does mention Jesus and mentions him somewhat earlier than Pliny and Tacitus. This is the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote a multi-volume work on the antiquities of the Jews, 20 volumes, in which he discusses numerous figures from the history of Judaism, from Adam and Eve up to his own day, including a couple of very brief references to Jesus. Josephus wrote this book about the year 90 or 95 of the Common Era, AD, so something like 60 or 65 years after Jesus' death, and he mentions Jesus on a couple of occasions. Within the first 100 years after Jesus died, these are the only certain references to him by non-Christians: Pliny, Tacitus, and Josephus. 3 very brief records of his life by non-Christians. Those are the only 3 accounts we have of his life within the first century following it. The Christian sources about Jesus, of course, are far more numerous, but the idea that there were thousands of people copying down his words and deeds, in fact, does not seem to be true. These Christian sources occur not just in the New Testament, but also outside the New Testament. The sources outside the New Testament are more plentiful than the Roman sources we have, but they're not particularly helpful, for the most part, for reconstructing what Jesus himself actually said and did. These other sources include other Gospels that did not make it into the New Testament, some of them discovered in relatively modern times, such as Gospels allegedly written by Peter and Philip and Thomas. Since the role of the feminine is of such interest to the Da Vinci Code, it's worth noting that the feminine did not always come off well in some of the earliest and most intriguing of our non-canonical sources. So you shouldn't be misled into thinking that the non-canonical Gospels have a very strong feminist slant as opposed to the canonical Gospels, which are masculinized. Let me give you just one example. One of our earliest Gospels outside the New Testament is the well-known Gospel of Thomas, discovered in a find of a library near the village of Nag Hammadi, Egypt, discovered in the year 1945. A very important document because it contains 114 sayings of Jesus, many of which aren't found in the New Testament. The last saying has caused some particular interest among readers of this gospel, precisely because of its understanding of the relationship of men and women. This is saying 114. Simon Peter said to them, "Let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life." Jesus said, "I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven." Well, if one were to go simply on the basis of the Da Vinci Code, one might think that outside of the New Testament Gospels, what we have are Gospels that celebrate the feminine, but I think one would be hard-pressed to talk about the celebration of the feminine in the Gospel of Thomas. Our most reliable sources for knowing what Jesus said and did, as it turns out, are found within the pages of the New Testament. And there, it is only our 4 Gospels that provide us with substantial information. There are 27 books in the New Testament, but only 4 of those books are Gospels that record the life, teachings, ministry, death, and resurrection of Jesus, the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It is worth noting, however, that these sources are by and large based on earlier sources that have since been lost. So that these gospel writers of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, Luke actually tells us explicitly that there were earlier gospels that he had available to him, and he's gotten his information from these. And they've all heard stories from eyewitnesses and from people who were telling stories about Jesus. So even though these gospels are our earliest written accounts that provide as much information, they themselves are based on earlier accounts. These 4 Gospels of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are usually dated to the second half of the first century. Normally, Mark is thought to be the first Gospel written, possibly around 65 or 70 AD. Matthew and Luke possibly around 80 to 85 AD, John probably sometime around 90 or 95 AD. In other words, these Gospels are separated from Jesus' life by a time gap of between 35 and 65 years. And they are our earliest Gospels that we have. Nothing outside the New Testament can approximate these Gospels when it comes to date. All of the Gospels that we have, both those inside and outside the New Testament, can be used to reconstruct what Jesus was really like, and to answer such questions as to whether he was celibate or married with children. But to reconstruct Jesus' life takes considerable methodological rigor. These documents that we have, these Gospels, are not the kinds of books that we can read and simply expect that they're going to give us biographically reliable information. These books are Gospels. They're not histories or biographies in the modern sense. The word gospel comes from the Greek word euangelion, which means good news. The authors of these books thought that they were writing down the good news of Jesus, meaning that they had a theological agenda in telling the stories that they tell. These gospel writers believed that Jesus was the Son of God who came to bring salvation to the world by dying on the cross. They told their story